Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, Transport Canada Federal Initiatives Update. My name is Janneke van der Zee, and I'm the Managing Director of ITS Canada. In front of you, you'll see today's agenda. Welcome, introductions, actual presentation, followed by Q&A. For those who have questions, please submit your questions in the questions pane. And at the end of today's presentation, we will share your questions with Craig Hutton, today's presenter. Today's webinar will be facilitated by Judy Yu. Judy Yu is the Roads Manager and ITS Specialist at Associated Engineering in Calgary. Judy is also the Chair of ITS Canada's Advanced Traveller Information Systems Technical Committee, which connects members with new techniques and programs being implemented across Canada and across the globe to ensure more safe, efficient, and reliable multimodal travel. Judy.
Thanks, Janneke. It's my pleasure to facilitate today's webinar session. And to all the ITS members on the webinar, I really hope you will consider joining one of our technical committees to make a difference for your organization and the industry. Please reach out to Janneke for more information. And now, without further ado, we'll proceed to today's presentation. When it comes to innovation and Canada, both these topics are very near and dear to me. And I think that innovation is all about creating meaningful change in the way that we interact with each other and the environment around us. I believe that in Canada, we have a unique context, which needs special attention. So it is with this in mind that I welcome our speaker, Mr. Craig Hutton. Mr. Hutton joined TC in 2006 with responsibility for developing and implementing the government's national policy framework for strategic gateways and trade corridors. Appointed Senior Director, Policy Integration and Research in 2009, and then subsequently Director General in July 2013, he has responsibilities for multimodal policy development and analysis, intergovernmental relations, policy research, government affairs, cabinet affairs, and is the departmental lead for policy development related to technology innovation, Arctic transportation and accessibility. Mr. Hutton led the government's establishment and response to the 2016 statutory review of the Canada Transportation Act, and is subsequently responsible for developing and implementing the Minister of Transport's vision, Transportation 2030, a strategic plan for the future of transportation in Canada. Mr. Hutton sits on the board of directors of the Intelligent Transportation Systems Society of Canada, where he continues to serve as TC's representative, providing advice concerning the technology trends and collaborating on initiatives of national interest. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Carleton University and a Master of Arts in Political Science from the University of Western Ontario. So with that, Mr. Hutton.
Thanks very much, Judy, for that introduction. And it's great to be with everyone today. This is a new format for me presenting, so looking forward to exploring this with you all in terms of how the presentation rolls. And I want to thank Janneke and Judy for helping with the setup for today's webinar. It is a great opportunity to connect with the ITS community. It's an interesting time to be talking about technology. It had been pre-COVID, and I think it'll be even more so as a result of COVID. And I think perhaps today we can touch on some of the emerging issues that would be helpful for us collectively to get a better understanding of in terms of what the current situation might bring in terms of adoption and use of technology in the transportation sector. But Canada, particularly Transport Canada and ITS Canada, have a great partnership going back many years. I am privileged to sit on the board of ITS Canada and as well in the department, as Judy mentioned, have responsibility for innovation policy writ large for the transportation sector as it relates to Government of Canada policies. So I've seen an interesting evolution in terms of where the department's been and where it's going in terms of its approach to transportation technologies. And today's really an opportunity to take stock of where we've been over the last couple of years, and where we're going, how we're viewing disruptive technologies in particular, in terms of the work we're doing at Transport Canada, and how we view working with partners in this space in terms of reinforcing our understanding of certain issues and reinforcing certain policy approaches to addressing what we see are the promises of disruptive technologies. So without much further by way of introduction, maybe I'll just launch into it. I'm going through a fair amount of territory here, trying to cover a number of issues, and hopefully, we do welcome comments and questions on any aspect of the presentation, including anything in terms of follow-up to today's discussion. But this slide, just in terms of covering a number of areas, the connected automated vehicles is something in particular that we've been working very hard on at Transport Canada. But there are many other areas that we are either embarking on more of a focused journey, such as freight technology and supply chains, getting to know cities a little better, getting a better understanding of e-commerce trends. These are all things that we're seized with, and it really started, I think, back with the minister's strategic plan that was launched in 2017, coming on the heels of the CTA review, which ITS Canada was quite involved with as the CTA panel, Canadian Transportation panel, had come out and consulted with industry. And one of the chapters that was included in their report did focus on innovation and technology. And given the incoming minister we had, and Minister Garneau, quite interested, obviously, in technology, and also interested in setting very ambitious goals for how we encourage further adoption in the transport sector of these emerging technologies. So it led to a unique period where we actually had a minister who, in his vision, for the first time, it actually showcased innovation as a theme, as part of a transport vision that was comprehensive in identifying other areas as well to improve transportation outcomes. And so as far as the thematic of innovative transportation in the minister's vision for transportation 2030, that did receive a good amount of attention over the subsequent years since 2017, but starting in 2017, particularly with the budget, there was $76 million devoted in that sort of initial phase to help us develop regulations for the safe adoption of CAVs and RPAS systems, or drones. There also was funding in there to work with industry, provinces, territories, and municipalities to establish pilot projects. And as well, there was an encouragement to work on standards and certifications for industry to safely deploy technologies in Canada. So these are things that directly were linked to that initial establishment of an innovation theme in the minister's vision, and it really gave us some good momentum to launch work, going from sort of what were ideas to now executing on various plans that had been developed to carry forward thoughts around how do we encourage CAVs and RPAS as part of that plan. And so looking toward other areas where the government, as part of that initial period as they were an incoming government, had a focus broadly on innovation, it dovetailed with a number of initiatives coming from other places in government, which also had a positive impact on the transport sector, such as the Innovation and Skills Plan led by Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, which was designed to spark growth and help Canada realize its potential as a global leader in innovation. And through this program, as an example, the government has been investing $40 million in QNX to develop safe and secure software systems for the next generation of CAVs. Very important work in terms of being able to do that. As well, there has been the Supercluster Initiative that many of you have likely heard of. And that was really a cornerstone of the Innovation and Skills Plan, which aimed to make Canada a world-leading innovation economy by investing in a small number of business-led ecosystems. And so close to $1 billion was being allocated to 5 recipients across the country, and that included Scale AI, and that was sort of for companies in the Quebec City Waterloo corridor to look at AI-powered supply chain supercluster, about a $230 million investment, particularly in that. And of course, that does help when you think about automotive industry and others in terms of how they're able to apply AI to supply chain and manufacturing. As well, the government pursued a regulatory reform agenda that was focused on supporting innovation and boosting business investment. And the goal here was really to make the Canadian regulatory system more agile, transparent, and responsive, so that businesses across the country could explore and act on new opportunities that could result in benefits for Canadians. And within this TC, Transport Canada, our department has developed the Transportation Sector Regulatory Review Roadmap that details the department's plans to address regulatory barriers to innovation and investment, in particular supporting new approaches that foster agile policy development in response to the rapid changes that we're seeing within industry. As we all know, the regulatory process can be quite a rigid, long process. There can also be barriers that sort of stand in the way, long-standing regulations that may suppress innovation. So this initiative helps re-examine how we approach regulation and make sure it can stimulate, while at the same time, stimulate growth, while at the same time guarding safety and security. And then finally, just on this slide here, Investing in Canada Plan and the Smart Cities Challenge, and as part of the $180 billion Investing in Canada Plan, the Government of Canada is contributing around $33 billion in federal investment towards significant infrastructure projects across the country. And these relate to really 4 priority areas, including public transit. Budget 2017 allocated $300 million over 10 years for Canada's Smart City Challenge, which some of you might be familiar with. And the winners included City of Montreal. They won the grand prize to help improve public transportation through the new and innovative forms of mobility and how those new technologies could be integrated in the public transportation and public transit systems. So all areas where we've had a stake and has required us to work within the federal family to ensure we're leveraging the benefits broadly for the transportation sector and getting the most that we can out of that broad innovation plan. So our approach at Transport Canada really has been around looking at new and disruptive technologies and sharpening our focus on the broad range of technologies that are out there and ensuring that we're aware of what's over the horizon. And that, you know, does require us to work closely with private sector and academia, which I'll touch on a little bit later. But it is ensuring that we don't sort of lose sight of the breadth, which is really quite remarkable, the breadth of change that's hitting transportation. Transportation is not unique in this aspect. I mean, so many other sectors are being driven by the same trends and drivers that we're seeing in transportation. But in particular, transportation, I think, has been a real showcase for what new technologies can do in terms of the new services and business models that can emerge. And so for us, really getting a handle on this has been important. But at the same time, that need for safety and security remains top of mind for us as a regulator. And so trust verification, it's incredibly important for the safety of these technologies, because if we don't get the safety question right, it's very difficult to unlock all the other benefits that these technologies can achieve. And so, there's policy and legal issues that arise with the introduction of new technologies we have to think through. There's risks related to consumer behavior in terms of how consumers will use the technologies, which can be different than perhaps how technologies may be envisioned being used. So that human factors angle to things really has to be thought through. Accessibility issues, impact on productivity, what it may do around the labor market generally in terms of creating new opportunities, but at the same time, perhaps speeding up areas where jobs perhaps were already at risk. And of course, that creates concerns. So addressing those kinds of things are important to encourage adoption, that we're looking at the full breadth of issues that arise. And of course, the environment is something as well here that is an issue that continues to be a focus. So things that help advance environmental objectives are critical. And of course, we need to fully understand what the impacts could be. There's other concerns, cross-cutting, and you'll be familiar with many of these around privacy, cybersecurity, ethics. These are all topical things. They're not unique to transport. They won't simply get solved in the transport space. But again, transport, in its application, these technologies to the transport sector, these technologies represent some of the issues that can arise around these topics, and also can present early opportunities to solve those issues and be instructive for other sectors in terms of how they may be dealing with privacy or cybersecurity or ethics. So we have opportunities. These aren't just risks. These are opportunities to have the transport sector as a bit of a leader in addressing these things and helping to contribute to overall solutions. And so regulators have to look at this full picture, and in this way, I think we also help build consumer confidence, and confidence being such a critical aspect of encouraging adoption. And if we don't get the confidence right, even though it may be proven as safe, but if you don't have the confidence there from those who will use the technology, there can be a lag, of course, in how these technologies ultimately get utilized and leveraged. The flexible regulatory, non-regulatory toolkit, this is something I already touched on, just this recognition, we have to be much more nimble and flexible in terms of how we're looking at our tools as a regulator. It's not in every case that a regulation is the answer. There's also the timing of when you bring in a regulation, and that process by which you regulate is even being looked at and is under pressure given so many fast-moving changes. So we've, I think, with some success, have looked at other ways through guidance documents, which I'll touch on, pilot projects. These are things which are complementary to and perhaps can come at earlier stages than regulation. And as I said, that timing of regulation becomes critical, because brought in too soon, it may not fully understand or comprehend or anticipate how to be utilized. Coming too late, perhaps maybe there's risks that emerge and then jeopardize overall the progress that has been made and could still be made in terms of a technological advancement. So complicated questions there. And then finally, just better aligning government's work here, both amongst governments within Canada, so domestically, making sure we're working with the province as well as with municipalities, and learning from each other. The pace of technological change is so quick. All of us have some different capacities and some different strengths in areas of focus that we're able to work on, and then come together and share those experiences, and therefore collectively deepen our capacity and accelerate our understanding of technologies and how, as governments, perhaps we can move in a positive way to encourage safe adoption of technology. So I've never, in my time in government, have seen so much interest in the need and importance of collaboration as I have around transportation technology. And similarly, we've seen it internationally as well with our international partners, whether it's been our work with Australia, our work with the European Union, and of course our work with the Americans, just to name a few. We have a good collaboration agreement where we had advanced a number of discussions as well with the Chinese. All of these discussions really have, from all parties at these tables, have been viewed as highly beneficial and to hasten the understanding. Of course, there's always still that emerges around these discussions, but fundamentally, at the core, there is a strong curiosity and interest in learning from each other as international jurisdictions as to how we're viewing these technologies and how we may be positioning and posturing to facilitate the adoption of these technologies together. So a very complex and dynamic environment that way. At the international level, certainly the G7 has been very, very important for us as a forum. We've also built, of course, strong relationship through the Council of Ministers responsible for transportation and highway safety, something I'll return to as well in a minute. Turning to a specific area where quite a bit of work has been happening. Not a surprise to many of you, because I think you've heard some of these discussions we've been holding around CAVs. A lot of our work really has been guided by the Standing Senate Committee report on CAVs, which was released in January 2018. And the report, at a high level, it concluded that while CAVs could have a number of benefits, including reduced automobile accidents, lower pollution, more mobility options for Canadians, and a variety of economic benefits, the full benefits of technology would not be able to be realized until a coordinated national strategy could be developed. And so in that sort of spirit, the report included 16 recommendations for the Government of Canada to consider. And these really touched across the broad range of mandates around government, including colleagues of ours at ISED, Innovation, Science, Economic Development Canada. And part of this effort really, in one of the recommendations, squarely focused on departments working more closely together. And so we have, with ISED, formed a very strong partnership where we chair a working group with the federal family inside of the Government of Canada to bring more coherence to how we're looking at the issues around CAVs. The other thing that this report pointed to was the need for model provincial policy for CAVs. There was also recommendations around developing a vehicle safety guidance for CAVs, recognition of support for research and development to encourage more testing in Canada. And the report also put a big emphasis on the need to monitor long-term policy implications and consider labor market impacts. So that broad view, not just focused just on the technology and how it works, but rather all the other issues that come along with CAVs and the fact that they're important in terms of this encouragement or acceleration of adoption. If we sort of leave the labor market questions behind and don't address them, that can be a hindrance. So really useful in terms of that report. It was our minister who asked for this report to be done by the Senate, and of course sparked quite a bit of work in return. And one of the more important things was this Vehicle of the Future Advisor Group, and that was launched with participants from the private sector, participants from academia and federal departments. And a lot of the work sort of happened between November 2018 and just before the last election, where there was a draft report that was provided by this group, and it focused on safety and security as a pillar, innovation, competitiveness, digital and physical infrastructure, data privacy and security, social impacts and risks. So again, really covering that waterfront and showing how holistically you have to look at the impacts, particularly when it comes to CAVs, look at the impacts of these vehicles and address some of the issues that are being raised. And so their report is under review now in terms of being provided to Minister Garneau and Minister Baines, and how it may guide future thinking and policies around CAVs. Another recommendation that came out of the Senate Committee report was to develop a model provincial policy for CAVs. And so as a federal department, TC worked with provinces and territories to develop a connected automated vehicle policy framework for Canada. And that was approved by all Canadian transport ministers in January 2019 and published. And that framework provided a number of foundational principles to help government, industry, and academia establish shared objectives, find ways to collaborate, and prepare proactively for when Canada deploys and adopts CAVs on our roads. And so the key principles in that, briefly in that framework, similar, you'll see some echoing here of the advisory group, but safety being the #1 priority. And 2 was information sharing and how critical that is to supporting safety and security issues, so that information sharing amongst governments being of vital importance. 3, the policy and regulatory alignment being important within Canada, so that we're not facing a patchwork emerge around how these vehicles might move, one barrier, one region of the country, given that our supply chains and trading networks, broadly speaking, should not be impeded by barriers between jurisdictions. And that extended as well to how we were looking at regulatory alignment with the US. And so the report also emphasizing that border piece with the US being critical to figure out as well. Principles for raising public education and awareness. A lot of, I think, issues that have stemmed from nomenclature that might be used, the readiness of the technology and its capabilities. So that being critical to make sure we're capturing it right, so that on one hand, we're not underplaying what the capabilities are doing, but on the other hand, we're also not overplaying capabilities and having consumers over-rely on aspects of the technology which may not have the capabilities that consumers perhaps have been told or expect that do. So this public education awareness will help increase confidence and effective usage of the technology. Proactive preparation by the federal government of provinces and territories and municipalities for CA arrival is needed. So that proactive, again, working together to make sure that pilot testing and so on, the results of those are shared, and that allows us to look at our legislative frameworks and take actions within our own areas of jurisdictions as required, and that continuous collaboration piece being rounding out a final principle that we need to work together on. So that framework is really important. Sorry to take a few minutes on that, but really has provided a foundational piece upon which all jurisdictions are kind of finding their way together in sharing our capacity. And it's led to a number of guidance pieces, which are also listed on this slide, whether it's Canada Safety Framework for CAVs, the Safety Assessment for Automated Driving Systems in Canada, our Testing Highly Automated Vehicles in Canada document, or the Canadian Jurisdictional Guidelines for Safe Testing and Deployment of Highly Automated Vehicles. All of these documents have been published and are providing industry, other jurisdictions with guidance in terms of how to be thinking about the technologies and what kind of, if it's legislation or other types of guidance, what to think about in terms of how to move on these technologies. In addition to those documents, just briefly, we're also working on a low-speed automated shuttles discussion paper. And so that will be something a little bit later this year. We're going to try to solicit some feedback to update our national testing guidelines for automated vehicles around these unique vehicle types based on that paper, so stay tuned for that. You might also be familiar with the fact that cooperative truck platooning has been a strong focus of TC for quite a number of years, and we continue and take quite a bit of research there to understand to deepen our understanding of the fuel efficiency benefits and the safety considerations associated with cooperative truck platooning systems. And we've got some further research planned in this area, so stay tuned on that. And then cyber guidance has been on the road to being finalized, and the publication of a document on this is forthcoming, and it will include some best practices on managing cybersecurity risks and protecting the entire vehicle ecosystem with safeguards, as well as how to detect, monitor, and respond to and recover from vehicle cybersecurity events. Another program I'll just mention here briefly is ACATS. I know a number of you are familiar with it. In fact, a number of ITS members participated in ACATS projects and proposals. I want to thank you for your active participation in that. I think this program has been quite a success with a modest amount of funding. It's really seeded quite a few, I think, ideas, which I think really is a really good, appropriate role for government to try to give a nudge in certain areas where there have been ideas, but perhaps just not that stimulus to get the ideas off the ground. And one of the areas has been version 3 of the ITS architecture for Canada, which was completed just in May. and that was funded through ACATS, and it's also now fully realigned with the US architecture reference for cooperative and intelligent transportation. And so the Canada's ITS architecture, it includes a reference framework for planning and defining and integrating ITS. There's also information and communication system requirements that are included in there, and how data should be shared and used. And the standards required to facilitate information sharing is all part of that. So that's been a great partnership as well with ITS Canada. So I think, in terms of looking beyond CAVs, where we've done quite a bit of work, we're really, starting to move more squarely as well into the freight technology and supply chain side. We've been looking at aspects of this through platooning and other things, but we're really wanting to look a little deeper at what technology applications can do in terms of benefiting supply chains in Canada. And, this is really more relevant than ever given COVID-19 and some of the issues that are arising around, supply chain impacts of economic disruption, and how technology can smooth some of those impacts and can raise the visibility of supply chains to help better identify where there may be barriers that need to be addressed by supply chain partners. And so, this really is coming as a result of decreasing sensor costs, ever increasing computer power that's available, and ubiquitous connectivity opportunities that exist that really help make supply chains smarter, faster, more predictive, and more agile. And so we've done a scan here of technologies in the freight sector, considering them in the context of 3 distinct waves in terms of what we think may be beneficial to supply chains. And for the first wave, as you see there, the focus really is on exploiting the opportunities provided by technologies that are past what we consider the tipping point, such as digital collaboration and Internet of Things. The second wave involves piloting and integrating applications of emerging technologies such as analytics, AI, and blockchain. So again, in the transport sector, it offers to be one of those sandboxes for AI. And of course, Canada being a leader in AI, how we can use and offer up transport logistics sector applications for AI to support this aspect of predictive nature of supply chains. The third wave centers on preparing for technological advances in the physical supply chain, including higher levels of automation in vehicles and operations at ports and intermodal hubs. And so, as I say, optimizing our supply chain technology, I think, is something where, we've been talking about this in the context of a few tables that we support. The commodity supply chain table, as you see on the upper left there, is a table that TC hosts, and the mandate of this table is to provide a consensus-based multimodal and national forum for producers, shippers, and service providers and other supply chain partners who are involved in this movement of commodities. And of course, this really arose acutely on the heels of grain supply chain disruptions, but broaden out because, of course, moving grain has impacts on other commodities in supply chain. So if you're addressing one commodity, you also have to look at the broad nature of commodities moving in supply chain and how they all work together, and how supply chain partners need to work together given the spillover effects that a problem in one area can have on another. One of the things that have been identified there is just making sure that there's better communication amongst supply chain partners, again, getting at this communication aspect, collaboration, and tools that allow that collaboration communication will help more readily identify when problems arise, getting to those problems, identifying what the problem is, defining it, and then trying to address a solution to it. I think our past experience has been, there's been many different interpretations of what the issue is. It's awfully hard to get to the solution because you have everybody with sort of their own set of facts. So this table really has been, I think, a forum to get together a little bit more to provide a forum to define issues and identify solutions. As well, we've got the Canadian Centre on Transportation Data, which is offering up data and information. It's really the tracking of logistics information and making that available to industry, and then bringing players together in a way that supports innovation based on easily accessible and visible data. We also have the AI-powered supply chains superclusters, which, as I mentioned earlier, was one of the winners through the supercluster model. And this has been something where we have been working with ICED, and it offers real opportunity for Canada, given Canada is a leader in AI. But here, we've got the fact that this is based in Montreal, but Scale AI brings together around 120 partners in the retail, manufacturing, transportation, infrastructure, information, and communications technology sectors together to look at building intelligent supply chains through artificial intelligence and robotics. So again, offering ourselves up as a bit of a sandbox in the transport sector for AI. Moving past supply chains, where we've really been trying to get those conversations going, which we've had some success with. We're also quite interested in the urban space. And so urban mobility and the challenges that are here, whether it's congestion, the fact that the Council of Ministers responsible for transportation highway safety have also been focused on the issue of congestion and how to tackle it through mobility solutions. That's something where even as the federal government, maybe in the past we haven't been as seized with, but I can tell you that even from a very narrow sort of federal view, we have our major ports, our major airports, major rail hubs, all of which, if you look at Canada's biggest urban areas, we have major federal assets located in these areas. If your urban centers aren't fluid, are facing congestion, then these major federal assets that facilitate international trade are also impeded. So that urban context, even just from that narrow perspective, is important. And if you broaden it out to, ensuring Canada's competitiveness with attracting talent, retaining talent, making sure businesses, the ease with which businesses can do their work, congestion writ large in our urban centers is of great interest to us at the federal level. We do have, in tandem with that, changing and rapidly changing user expectation. And then many of you are already familiar with this because you work in these fields where you've got sort of user expectations that are rising based on the capabilities of technology. So real-time information, that appetite for real-time information, and having mobility services that are tailored to individual needs at the time and place where those needs need to be met. Those are rising, and I think we're chasing a bit of that as we should be, but we're also able to shape that user expectation, I think, as well, if we can work together on better understanding what the capabilities of technologies are, and therefore together, what are the service opportunities and business opportunities that are there, and then how can government play a role in supporting those new business models going forward, helping in turn to attract investment. E-commerce and freight pressures, which I'll get to in a little bit again, but here, in the urban context, more of a fraught space. If you just think about that curbside, which is many seminars that I've been at in the recent year and a half, that's becoming the real interesting topic, is curb space, because of the rise of e-commerce and curb space, of course, being used by bikes and pedestrians, but also trucks and couriers. So that being an example of the pressures that are there, and some great examples, such as in Montreal, around bike courier trying to ease the congestion from delivery trucks through more of a bicycle courier distribution model. And then urban planning, really this planning, I think, is brought to the forefront and has been, I think, excited by the CAV vision, the connected automated vehicles, and what that may do in terms of freeing up space that's been typically reserved for parking and other things. And so urban designers thinking, maybe there's a bit more of a blank slate to work from in terms of how we think through the redesign of our cities for the future and repurpose space that was perhaps saved for technologies that over time will fall by the wayside. And so that urban planning has been, I think, a really big focus, and the opportunities, a lot of optimism in that area. But I think all of us coming to the table on understanding that urban planning process and the ingredients that go into that and the stake we all have in that, I think that's a really interesting conversation that's been going on. And then finally, infrastructure investment. Here, in terms of the infrastructure investment, huge needs around infrastructure investment going forward, and of course, constrained ability of municipalities to meet, especially, in the post-COVID or recovery era that we're going to be moving into. Infrastructure is still a great catalyst for growth. But making sure those investments get made in a timely manner, especially when we have a backlog on infrastructure investment already, that will be a challenge and will require these innovative partnerships, but it'll also require applications of technology to make better use of the existing capacity that is there in our infrastructure by integrating technology into those hard physical assets. So just moving on here, just on the urban mobility side, we are, as I mentioned briefly, we are working very closely with the provinces and territories on urban mobility issues. And, this is something where we are participating on a task force on urban mobility with the Ministry of Transportation of Ontario. And the task force was established by the Council of Ministers in 2019 with a 2-year mandate to deliver an interim report. And the areas of work here are around innovation, technology, finance, and funding, governance, land use. So the interim report will kind of organize its work around that. And the second deliverable will be a final report that will focus on some policy options and a vision for urban mobility in Canada, which the target there is to be presented to ministers next winter. And so things have been obviously slowed down a little bit by COVID, so we're going to have to take stock of the work, but this was of high priority, especially for larger jurisdictions, and is still work is going on, and it's still of top priority. Conference Board of Canada is doing quite a bit of work on shared mobility. They've done it in the past through their roundtable on shared mobility and the Centre for Transportation Infrastructure. They have a new initiative on urban transformation, which represents a continuation of their former 2 initiatives I just mentioned. And so we're working with the Conference Board on these issues. And again, I think gives us good insights in terms of urban space and how that is changing. Roundtables that they are launching as a result of their urban transformation initiative. It's going to include all levels of government, mobility experts, city and community leaders, academia, and others. It'll be a 3-year initiative they're looking at having. It'll be planned for launch later this year. 4 meetings are scheduled to be held each year. I think that's the plan, 2 in Eastern Central Canada and 2 in Western Canada, and each roundtable meeting will produce a comprehensive briefing report with evidence-based insights. So something to watch for as well if you haven't been already aware of that one. E-commerce, I mentioned this a little bit, but it is worth, in terms of our focus at Transport Canada, it's worth us taking a little bit of a deeper look at what the trends are. Huge growth area here in terms of e-commerce. I think COVID has only encouraged this growth, and the fact that our stats that we had pre-COVID was 4.5% of total retail sales in 2013 to more than 10% in 2019, and it's projected to exceed 35 billion by 2023. And so this, of course, has great benefits, but also a number of things to also address, given the additional considerations that come along with the explosion of e-commerce. We have issues related to whether it's that urban space and the fact that there's greater wear on roads, greater congestion, that fraught space around curb space, even sidewalk congestion, given there's increasing use of bots as part of this e-commerce delivery model. Some experts estimate that 80% of all items will one day be delivered by delivery bots. But of course, that does have implications for sidewalk congestion and how we manage sidewalks, so bringing that in. And of course, it does have implications for RPAS systems or drones. And of course, as you likely know, Amazon, with their Prime Air, they're looking at service to deliver packages of up to 5 pounds to customers in 30 minutes or less. So of course, that has major implications for airspace within cities, which is complicated given condominiums, people below, and so on. So that's a new area for Transport Canada, given our regulatory function that we have to think through. So maybe I'll just I'll leave it there, and I'll just leave it with these questions, and I'm really interested in sort of your perspectives on how can we ensure that the next generation of ITS is positioned to evolve and step with emerging transport needs. Sorry, I just lost my my slide there. I'll bring it back. Automotive firms are building and investing in new mobility services, such as the ride-hailing, e-bikes and scooters. Are there policy choices that can both influence investment and support government's goals in achieving our transportation objectives? And how do we see the role of business as usual unfolding in a post-COVID-19 world? And I think collectively, I don't think anybody's got, there's a single answer on this yet. That emerging world, the new normal, I think informed by some of the drivers and pressures that we're starting to see now. How will those play out over the medium, longer term? Micromobility is an aspect, I think, where we're seeing a huge uptick. My team has been following developments in China, and of course, micromobility, particularly bikes and scooters in China, huge increase in usage there, just given avoidance of subway and mass transit. Similar, I was reading an article yesterday in Rome, which was a latecomer to scooters, but a huge uptick in the use of scooters in Rome as a result of COVID and transit considerations and using mass transit. And of course, this will evolve over time as solutions come, we hope, to the COVID situation, vaccines and so on. But obviously, some of these can change behaviors more permanently, whereas some are more just temporary shifts. So thoughts around that, thoughts around partnerships with cities and how that may change, because cities really are on the forefront of some of these disruptive technologies, and how the planning had been done around what was the future anticipated within those urban spaces. How might that change in the future, and how will the partnerships change as a result? So your insight on partnerships and what that may mean for cities going forward, I'd be also interested in hearing. I'll pause there. I've been through quite a bit, and it'd be great to hear questions and perspectives.
Craig, I have a couple questions while others ponder your questions, perhaps, if you don't mind.
Sure.
There is a question that came in and said, thanks, Craig. Wondering if you can share any information relating to the second phase of the Smart City Challenge. Is there any current information on when that will be released? Also, any conversations that can be shared regarding whether there will be a second round of ACATS funding based on the success of the first round at building capacity strength in Canada?
Thanks, Judy. Those are great questions. And I think in both cases, there was really good success on both the Smart Cities Challenge as well as with ACATS. I don't have anything to share today with respect to whether there'll be sort of a second round on both those programs. I think both programs were really recognized with some modest seed money, what it was able to stimulate on the other side. There was great take-up on both these programs. And so the degree to which there's success achieved, I think it's been recognized. And I think it was in the industry as well. So it's something that we have been sure to reinforce internally around how programs like that offer a real supportive role in terms of achieving objectives around adoption of technology. And it's been successful in other jurisdictions as well, Smart Cities Challenge in particular, whether it's the US or in Europe. That's been a great model to stimulate thinking and create new partnerships amongst jurisdictions and academia and the private sector. So nothing I can share today, unfortunately, but I just do want to the interest in those questions it's well placed, and I think from our perspective, we have viewed them as great successes. So thanks for the questions.
Is there any way to, for participants who are interested in that, to submit that further up the chain for an answer, or is it just something that there hasn't been any consideration, and so there isn't a way to ask?
So certainly we always encourage letters of support. So, I mean, if there's a letter or email that somebody wants to provide that really supports, the aims of those programs and the benefits that they've achieved from, your perspective, really encourage that being sent in. That always helps. As far as any kind of more formalized process, there isn't anything right now around that.
Okay, thanks for that. We have a question around ITS Canada's maybe a greater participation in the dialogue that's going on, that's either led by Transport Canada or that your organization's a part of. Just wondering, for the members on the call here, from us as members of ITS Canada, how can we engage with Transport Canada more? It seems like all of the topics you talked about are relevant to our membership base and are actually really important. I personally, when I look at it from the ITS professionals' perspective, and would like a chance to sit in or participate to some degree on those discussions.
Yep, that's a great question. So I would say, on the advisory committee for CAVs, there's been representation by ITS members. The ACATS program, great partnership there. When we had the CAV framework put into place, that was something we made sure kind of came out to ITS Canada, so members could know what progress was being made through the table of ministers. I think there'll be further progress there, particularly on this transit. We're not leading it, but this transit working group that the Ministry of Ontario for Transportation for Ontario is leading. That is something as well. When we're in a position to share something with you, I'll take it upon myself to make sure that the results are shared out to the group through Yannicka, so people are informed as to the progress that we're making. I also had a great conversation with Ian and with Yannicka just around when we're having conferences or broader discussions, to make sure that I'll update everyone as similar to today, but not maybe just quite as long, but would take the opportunity to make sure people are aware of the discussions that are happening and where there's opportunities to participate in discussions if that hasn't already been offered up. So making sure there's sort of regular updates done that way. And I think Ian and Yannicka, we're agreeing it'd be a great addition to annual meetings and other kinds of discussions that will happen through ITS Canada.
That's awesome. I think that would be great to have some visibility, and today was really informative. I think you really packed in the content. Thanks very much, Greg. We actually have a ton of questions come in, and they're all great. So if you don't mind, let's tackle them sequentially and see how far we get.
Sure.
Okay, the next is, what plans are there for creating a digital twin for transportation infrastructure?
So that's a really interesting way to put it. One of the things I think we can all recognize together is that it's been, the physical side has been on a pathway for decades in terms of how we approach the development of physical infrastructure. The digital infrastructure has been a tougher go, and we're still at a stage where the engineering that goes into the physical infrastructure often doesn't take into account the digital side. And when you're going to build something, are you thinking at the same time as how do you integrate technology into that infrastructure so you can maximize its potential or optimize the capacity it may offer? Or just even existing infrastructure, how can you, instead of building new, look at your existing infrastructure and say, before we put another dollar into the hard side of what we've got to do, add a lane, or expand the bridge, can we better utilize the existing capacity through sensors or other kinds of built-in technology. How we stimulate that, I think, is a really good question. I'm really open to ideas around that. I mean, part of that and what we have done is made it part of the criteria that if you're submitting a proposal on infrastructure, you've got to include how you're meeting the technology aspect, this integration of technology. How far we go in enforcing that, I think, is a bit of a question going forward, and really welcome ideas on that. But it's really the integration of the two that we need, so that they're being thought of at the same time and they're being worked through, that both are complementary. The technology is complementary to the hard infrastructure.
Yeah, and I believe that that is the best way for uptake, because you're talking about a major shift in thinking of people who are programmed to build infrastructure, and we've been programming for many, many years. So in order to adopt change, it has to be comfortable. It has to be some degree of comfort of knowing that there is a blend of the two, rather than abandoning completely what they used to do and having to change everything very quickly. So I think that is a good approach. The next question is, what is Transport Canada's perspective on the mobility data specification?
Mobility data specification. So the data side is difficult because, I mean, this is an area that's being worked out in many sectors. A lot of the data we work with, we get from service providers, but some of it's confidential out of competitiveness issues. So it's shared with Transport Canada, but cannot be disseminated further. Some of it can be made public if it can be masked or positioned the right way. Ownership of data and the source is always a difficult thing. Who can use it for what purposes? These are difficult questions to sort through. So if I just take the commodity supply chain table as an example, these are issues that have been wrestled with. We've got a privileged forum there in which to look at our supply chain issues. It does depend on good shared data, visible data to the table, so we can define those issues and then target the right solutions. But I would even say there, the conversation has been, it's been over the last number of years. It takes time to develop those partnerships and make sure there's trust between partners. And even still, there's going to be limitations on what can be shared more visibly amongst the broad range of partners versus to us as a regulator. And there's a certain amount of data that we can compel as a regulator from transport partners, but that still doesn't mean we're able as a regulator to share it further. We can use it for our policy development purposes, but it may not benefit other partners in the supply chain who are responsible for regulating or operating or owning other parts of the supply chain. So there are real challenges there in how we do this. So there's going to be work-throughs and going to be different solutions based upon what the issues we're after. But this is a longer-term conversation, I think, that will be had, and it's been a big component, for example, of our CAV advisory group. Data was an aspect of every pillar we talked about, and it was a difficult one. And for example, the social impacts, getting data so that it would benefit areas of an urban space where perhaps there was housing, public housing, make sure that services were as available to those areas as services were available to richer areas. It raises real interesting issues and can widen, if not done properly, can further exacerbate disparities between regions, between people, if not done properly. So these are things that we're collectively working on. It's gonna be a long conversation, I think, yet to have. And data is something different to everybody in terms of exactly what are you talking about, what are you collecting, and exactly for who and what purpose. So broad-based solutions aren't necessarily always going to work either.
Yeah, definitely a lot to think about. I believe I'm on a working group for the Standards Council of Canada, and they are addressing a number of issues in this space, but that's still in the works at the moment, so not finalized, but certainly lots of input from all sectors, including healthcare, in light of COVID, in light of personal information about health, and then even the use of data after the person has passed, is that, and the ownership rights to the data. So really interesting, and yes, very hot topics at the moment. We've got another question here that came in. It says, how does TC see its role in encouraging the use of standards by provinces and municipalities to aid in data sharing interoperability, especially in light of CAVs? That was somewhat answered in your presentation, but yeah, maybe you could elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, so that does stem back to the work of the Council of Ministers, where a number of guidance documents have gone out to help with those standards and how are we thinking collectively about these issues. And based on sort of a broad agreement that while each region might have specific needs and each jurisdiction has its own authorities that either one of us is not going to tread on, there is at the core here a broad-based understanding and agreement that we don't want a patchwork to emerge across the country, that we do want, in the case of CAVs, we want them to operate seamlessly across borders. And so from that point of view, it is working together and using guidance documents. I mean, eventually those could translate to the standards, or, you know, there could be a federal regulation, but of course that will never replace where a province or territory has the responsibility to regulate, but they can mirror that in their own regulations. Other ways in which these issues are being looked at is sort of model legislation. And so models and CCMTA has been working on issues like this, where there's model legislation that's put out saying, here are the elements you should think about including if you're going to legislate specifically within your jurisdiction on these technologies. So model legislation is another way of addressing this sort of standardization amongst jurisdictions. It's a very complicated issue, but I think the good news here is that there's been a lot of work in the last 2 years on this question. And as I said, what's held it together is fundamentally this agreement that yes, there should be interoperability across borders. And we should not be suppressing innovation. We all want to benefit from the promise of these technologies. So let's work together to facilitate that. And to me, that's been the optimistic part of this. The complicated part is how do we put that into practice? And this model legislation, guidance documents, sharing of information, findings from pilot projects, and so on. That's been kind of a how. So I think we've come quite a distance there, but we still have more to go. And I think we've got to watch for barriers that might unexpectedly spring up. Sometimes the intention is not to have a barrier, but in effect there is, or there could be something standing in the way from the past that hasn't been identified as a barrier, but somehow surfaces as such, and addressing that previous regulation that might be standing in the way is needed. So again, collectively, how do we manage those kinds of issues? By having that conversation together, I think, as jurisdictions, and making sure that we're keeping a line of sight with the private sector on how the development is going, how the testing is going, and getting those findings, and so that those findings inform our guidance and our regulations as a result.
Do you outreach to the province and municipalities, or is it only if they come and ask questions?
Yeah, so we do outreach a lot, actually, and it is through CCMTA. TAC plays a role on the infrastructure side, forums like ITS Canada, but I would say the main one where sort of the harder business is getting done around this guidance work is within the Council of Ministers responsible for transportation and highway safety, and it is quite proactive there. And we have a governing council for CAVs that brings together TAC, brings together CCMTA, and the Policy Planning and Support Committee of the Council of Ministers, all together. And we have a duty to report to ministers once a year on the work that's collectively happening amongst jurisdictions to do with CAVs. So it kind of puts our feet to the fire in kind of marshaling everything that's been done over the course of the year and report out to ministers, and then ministers can give direction on where they would like to see more work done, where there's gaps that may be emerging. But it's also a reflection of how we're collectively as governments working with the private sector as well. So that's a key part of it. And I would say ITS has been highlighted in those reports as well.
That's great. Thank you. Here we have a question around zero emission micromobility. Do you feel like the Canadian government may promote the use of these alternatives? Any chance that it would be made mandatory for scooters and power-assisted bikes as mobility options within urban centers?
So this is where, you know, the Federation steps in, and you've got the differences in jurisdiction between the federal government and the role that provinces play and municipalities play. Like when it comes to, you know, scooters being allowed within a municipal area, that will, yes, that'll involve most directly the municipality to agree the province. At the federal level, you know, not as much. We regulate vehicles and emissions around vehicles themselves, new vehicles in particular. And so that is an area where, you know, we need to work together. We have an interest in sort of the micro mobility modes, but we don't have, like, for example, I was talking about bots in my presentation, you know, that regulation of sidewalk space. We may have an aspect of the bot itself, depending upon its weight and configuration, and it may be considered a vehicle, where then we step in and there's an aspect around the vehicle, and is the vehicle itself safe, but then its use on the street or its use on the sidewalk, that is something that will come from the municipality and come from the province.
That's fairly, yeah, reasonable. We have another question here. It says, in what areas of transportation innovation does Transport Canada see itself in Canada as leaders versus fast followers? And how does this impact investment and funding? Oh, that's a big question.
That is, yeah, and it's a great question. So this idea of the fast follower, I think writ large, you know, Canada is a fast followers and a fast follower in a number of ways. You know, Canada generally is a leader on AI, but how AI is applied to the transport sector, I think, is a real opportunity for us. I think it's happening, but the question of the degree to which it's happening, I think, is something that could be sparked further. And I think the Supercluster Initiative will help with that. But I think there's other opportunities even beyond Supercluster to think about the application of AI. And that's one area where Canada, I think, is recognized as a world leader in terms of the number of companies we have in AI. Coming a little bit more back to sort of the ITS, CAV, and so on space. CAVs, I think I think we've done a good job in keeping up in a number of areas on CAV. We don't have the kind of spending or drivers, say, that they have in the US or other head office OEM, you know, countries, as in Europe, to be a leader in this space. But we are a fast follower. There's some good investment, and I think the work that we've been doing with the CAV Advisory Council and others are helping to identify how we could become more of a solid fast follower and do this attraction of investment into Canada. Cybersecurity is an area where I think Canada has done great work because we've got firms there that lead on this. And the other thing I would say is that you know, the government itself doesn't do the innovation. It is the private sector, and I think it's, you know, the role of government really is to help get out of the way and not be a barrier to that innovation, and try to encourage it and identify the benefits of it wherever possible. And so that's to the benefit of investment in Canada and jobs in Canada. It's to the benefit of creating greater efficiency in our transportation systems, whether that's for freight or for passengers. And so CAVs has presented us with a great all-round opportunity, if you think about truck platooning, if you think about CAVs, to be the potential of a fast follower on CAVs. And I think the KPMG rankings are, you know, have recognized Canada as being one of the top nations in terms of the work that we're doing on CAVs. We kind of float all over those rankings a bit, but one of the areas I think we've been recognized for is our legislative frameworks in the past, our regulatory approaches, some of our policies, some of the pilot testing that's going on in Ontario in particular, I think have been recognized in that KPMG report in terms of boosting our ranking internationally. So that's certainly one area. I think areas that we have a ways to go, I think it is in supply chain. I think, you know, the transport sector, I think probably can do a better job adopting technology. The transport sector writ large often is not an early adopter, despite some of the successes that you see in some aspects of the transport sector. I think more writ large, I think there's more that can be done to encourage technology uptake. And so it's government's role to help identify where those are and identify the size of the issue that we're dealing with. So for us, it's really about improving Canada's competitiveness in terms of, say, its ability to move international trade. What kind of technologies can help us move our international trade, you know, more efficiently in the future and get our supply chain workers, partners working more effectively together, because supply chains tend to be quite fragmented, and the trends are to become more fragmented, given how world trade is moving. So we got to get our act together even more, because the competitiveness forces there are going to come down on us pretty hard in the coming years. So that's an area I think for real improvement. So if we're going to look for an improvement, that's an area of improvement. If I think of great progress at CAV, if we're on the cutting edge, AI, but that's kind of outside the transport box, we apply it to transport, and those AI leaders in Canada can really help transport as well.
Awesome. We have 2 more questions. I'm hoping people can stick around. We're just going to wrap up here after the 2. Let Craig go, and I'm sure he has other engagements to attend to, but let's see if we can get through the last 2 here. Are there plans for the CCTD to collect or acquire real-time and predictive data?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a tall order. You know, part of the issue becomes that a lot of the data, especially the data we regulate, ends up being historical data, right? So not that you can't do predictives with that, but there is a lag in terms of the data that we bring in. And so regulation can only get you so far in terms of how you might collect your data and what you can use it for and so on. But to get to a point where, you know, we're getting to more real time and predictive, that is a place we want to be. And I think I mentioned earlier, I mean, consumers' expectation out there and users of the system writ large, whether you're a shipper or whether you're a passenger, in looking at the transport services that are there that you're looking to use, you want that real-time data to inform your own planning and choices, which can influence, you know, costs and other things. So I think our goal really is to get to a place where we have more real-time data. If we're thinking about the supply chain aspect, it is to get more really in the moment understanding of what problem are we facing this week. I think we can, you know, we've gotten to the place where we're able to say what was the problem we were seeing 2 weeks ago. I think we're there, and I don't know that we're really in the moment of being able to define, you know, this week real time or to predict where we see a problem arising. We probably have a good idea, but not to a quantitative predictivity sort of standard. So that is a place we'd like to go. I think it's going to take quite a bit of time. I think part of it too, as you might all appreciate, is the capacities to crunch this data. It's not only just collecting it, but there's an enormous amount of data, and you've got to have the systems to process it and to identify what parts of it do you need to predict what kind of activity that you're interested in. So I think all organizations are wrestling with this, and the power of computing that's required for that is pretty substantive. So these are things I think we're wrestling with, and that's why it's so great to work, you know, with the private sector, with academia on these questions, and because ultimately that is the goal.
Exactly. Yep, hard to achieve. Sounds simple, but very hard to do.
Right.
Finally, and Rod, thanks for your patience. Last but not least, there's a question here from Rod asking that you mentioned Vancouver and Montreal ports in your presentation, receiving a bit of a special look at? And are there any freight corridors which will be given priority in the future?
So I think that's a good question as well. I think one of the things we were concerned about and still are is our Western trade corridor because of the issues that we were seeing and the growth that we are anticipating on the West Coast. And a lot of the issues really come down to the port of Vancouver and really the lower mainland writ large. And that's the rail capacity that's there, the difficulty in the urban space and land use, whether it's condominiums, other things, and in the proximity of rail lines that have been there for a long time, but now are under pressure from development. The ability to expand capacity is limited. Again, this is where technology solutions can offer something, I think. There is sort of an issue of passenger movements versus freight, unfortunately. Choices around who's moving and when. That's on rail, but it also translates on the roadside. There's the port facility itself, all its facilities. Any expansion, of course, is difficult to do, and again is dictated and influenced, and rightly, by community concerns as well. So this is a difficult issue, I think, in order to continue to support the growth that we're anticipating on the West Coast, is how to manage these issues in the urban context, community context, to meet the growth for Canada's commodities in particular, but also for intermodal goods too. We're not seeing that as much on the East Coast. The East Coast has been more about the spare capacity and how can it be better utilized. And I've seen actually articles more recently talking about the opportunity that exists on the East Coast and how trade globally is moving now that CN, for example, is thinking there's greater opportunities on the East Coast to use the existing capacity. We're seeing some issues in Southern Ontario, border crossing had been under a lot of pressure. I think the Gordie Howe Bridge, that planning process acting as a reliever there, but of course the highway systems being incredibly congested around the GTA, that's been of concern, and I think is driving a bit of the work there as we look at passenger rail, or as we look at hubs connecting our airports, because of course movements of business travelers and tourism out of those important air hubs, particularly out of Toronto, Pearson, if that's impeded by congestion, then our airport's not very efficient. So I would say sort of that Southern Ontario, Montreal, Western corridor, but the Western corridor probably being the most vexing challenge, those being the real issue. So if you've got solutions that you're thinking of offering, and you've got products, from a supply chain perspective, applying it to those kinds of dynamics, offering in those kinds of contexts, I think will be of greatest benefit. So I'm happy to have more of a conversation around that, but that could be worth another discussion, maybe at another point, as a part of an ITS, annual meeting or something. Happy to do that.
Did you just sign yourself up for more work, Craig? Good job.
I was trying to avoid it. If this had finished at 2:30, that wouldn't have happened.
Exactly. Speaking on trade corridors, so that was great, and certainly thank you for all your thoughtful answers. Thank you for the audience submitting your questions. They're all awesome. Not to belabor this extended webinar any longer, just wanted to thank Yannicka for organizing, as well as Craig for your presentation, and wish everyone a great day. Please reach out to us again in the future if you have any topics you'd like to hear about, and we'll do our best to organize them.
Thank you, Judy. Thanks.
All right, take care, everyone.